The neighborhood always looked peaceful from the outside, like a quiet painting of suburban life. Fresh lawns trimmed every Sunday, white fences standing straight, and children's laughter spilling into the air. But behind those walls, not every house was built on kindness. Karen lived at the end of Willow Creek Lane, a woman known less for her baking or smiles and more for her complaints. She called the city on people for their lawns, scolded teenagers for being loud, and left notes about garbage bins being out too long. Yet, nothing could match the cruelty she unleashed when she decided to punish the Martinez family. The Martinez home wasn't grand. It was a small, modest house, paint peeling, porch light broken, but it was full of warmth. Daniel Martinez, the father, worked long hours as a mechanic, and his wife Alina cared for their 3 children. They weren't rich, but they had each other, and that made their evenings lively with laughter. Karen, however, despised them. She hated the way their kids' soccer balls sometimes rolled into her yard, and she claimed their backyard barbecue smoke ruined her weekends. One summer morning, she found a way to strike at them harder than ever before. She walked across her property line with a smug smile, twisted a valve that linked to their shared underground connection, and cut off their water supply. Within hours, the Martinez home turned into chaos. The sink coughed nothing but air, the shower refused to run, and even the kids' cries for a drink went unanswered. Alina, holding an empty glass, stood in shock. "What happened?" she whispered. Daniel went to confront Karen, his face tired but respectful. She stood at her doorway with her arms crossed, lips curled into a smirk. "Karen, our water's out. Did something happen?" he asked. Her answer was a dagger. "Oh, I know what happened," she said. "Maybe if you people respected the neighborhood, you'd still have running water. But since you don't, consider this a lesson." Daniel's chest burned with anger. He wanted to shout, but he knew yelling at Karen was like throwing wood on fire. So he clenched his fists, turned, and walked away. He told Alina they'd figure something out, but his voice carried no certainty. What Karen didn't realize was that she had just made an enemy out of the one man she should never have crossed. Because next door, in the gray house with the ivy climbing its walls, lived Jacob Harlow, a quiet man who kept to himself, always polite but distant. Neighbors only knew he was a widower, someone who rarely talked about his past. They didn't know that Jacob wasn't just an ordinary man living a lonely retirement. He had once been an undercover army spy, trained to dismantle enemies without leaving a trace. And when he watched the Martinez children crying for water, something inside him stirred that he thought had died years ago, the instinct to protect. That night, while the neighborhood fell silent, Jacob sat by his window in the dark, watching Karen's house. His old instincts whispered to him, his eyes tracing the way she moved, the locks she used, the little vulnerabilities she didn't even know she had. He had seen tyrants before. Karen was no different, just a smaller one, hiding in suburbia, hurting good people because she thought no one would stop her. But Jacob wasn't going to let her win. The war that Karen had started wasn't going to end the way she thought. The next morning, the sun rose golden over Willow Creek Lane, but for the Martinez family, it felt like a cruel spotlight on their suffering. Alina tried to fill pots with bottled water they had saved, rationing what little they had for the children. Daniel had called the water company, but they told him the problem was on private property. It could take weeks for an investigation, and even then they'd need proof that Karen had done it. Without that, they were powerless. Karen, on the other hand, strutted across her driveway in a silk robe, watering her roses with a long green hose. She knew exactly what she was doing. Every spray of fresh, sparkling water over her flower bed was another jab into her neighbor's wounds. She smiled at the children through the hedge as if daring them to run over with their empty cups. Jacob watched it all from his porch. He hadn't interfered in anyone's life for years. He lived quietly, with only his late wife's pictures on the mantel and his garden that he tended in silence. But something about seeing those kids press their lips to empty cups struck him deep. He had seen children suffer before, in villages torn apart by greed and power. He had promised himself he was done with battles. But maybe some wars weren't fought overseas. They were fought right here, on quiet streets, against people who thought cruelty was power. That evening, Jacob walked over to Daniel. "Mind if I lend a hand?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp. Daniel sighed, shaking his head. "You've been kind, Jacob, but this isn't your fight." Jacob's eyes didn't waver. "I don't fight for myself, I fight for what's right." Those words sounded like steel. Daniel nodded slowly, as though recognizing something behind Jacob's calm expression, something dangerous, something powerful. The following day, Jacob began his quiet war. He didn't confront Corinne directly, he didn't yell. No, Jacob was trained for patience, precision. He walked his yard, trimming his ivy with slow purpose while his eyes studied Corinne's house. Every detail mattered. The rusty side gate she never locked, the electrical panel she left exposed, the small habits, like how she left her sprinklers running all night even when it rained. That night, while the neighborhood slept, Jacob moved like a shadow. He approached the buried water valve Corinne had tampered with. His old hands, though lined with age, worked with the steadiness of a man who dismantled bombs. Within minutes, the Martinez family's water came back to life, gurgling through pipes like salvation. Alina woke up to the sound of the faucet singing, tears filling her eyes as she filled glass after glass. But Jacob wasn't done. He knew Corinne. A person like her would notice the change and strike back harder. This wasn't just about water anymore, it was about control. He needed her to know she wasn't untouchable. The next morning, Corinne stormed out of her house in fury when she realized the Martinez family had water again. She banged on their door, screaming, "You think you can outsmart me?" The children huddled behind Alina, who stood trembling but defiant. Before Corinne could spit more venom, Jacob stepped onto his porch. "Corinne," he said, his voice steady, almost too calm, "this ends now." She turned, her eyes narrowing. "And who do you think you are, old man? Stay out of it or you'll regret it." Jacob didn't flinch. He walked closer, his shadow stretching across her lawn. "I've faced dictators who thought they could crush families like yours. And they all learned the same thing. You can't win when you fight against people who have nothing left to lose." For the first time, Corinne faltered. Something in his tone, low, deadly certain, shook her. She stormed back into her house, but Jacob knew this was far from over. Corinne wasn't the type to retreat quietly. She was plotting, and Jacob could already feel the storm coming. He went home, sat in his dark kitchen, and pulled out a small wooden box he hadn't touched in years. Inside lay his old army knife, dog tags, and a folded letter from a commander who once called him the man who could make shadows fear. His fingers tightened around the knife. This wasn't just about saving the Martinez family anymore. This was about teaching Corinne what true strength was, and what real defeat felt like. Corinne didn't sleep that night. The image of Jacob standing firm against her burned in her mind like an insult she couldn't swallow. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by an old widower with cold eyes. By morning, she was already plotting. If he wanted to play protector, then he would taste her wrath too. The next evening, the Martinez family sat down for a humble dinner when their lights suddenly flickered, then went dark. Daniel rushed outside to check the breaker box, but it was locked tight. Someone had tampered with it. Alina held her children close, the youngest crying in fear. From across the street, Corinne's laughter carried through the darkness like poison. "Enjoy your candle-lit dinner," she sneered from her porch, her wine glass catching the glow of her garden lights, which blazed bright while her neighbors sat in shadow. Jacob, sitting in his own dimly lit kitchen, clenched his jaw. He had expected this. He had warned himself she would escalate, but still, seeing the children frightened pushed him beyond patience. The neighborhood was watching now. Curtains twitched, eyes peered out, but no one dared to speak against Corinne. She had cowed them all with years of threats and spite. Not this time. Jacob stood, strapped his old army knife to his belt, and stepped out into the night. He moved toward Corinne's porch with the calm stride of a man walking into a battlefield. "Turn it back on," he said, his voice low. Karen smirked, sipping her wine. Or what? You think your war stories scare me? This is my neighborhood, my rules. Jacob leaned in close, so close she could see the steel in his eyes. You think you've fought battles. You've never heard a mother scream when her children are taken. You've never seen what real monsters do, but I have. And I can tell you you're one of them. Small, pathetic, but a monster all the same. Karen's smile cracked for the briefest second before she snapped back. Get off my property, freak, before I call the police. Jacob didn't flinch. He turned and walked back into the shadows, but his silence was more terrifying than any threat. That night, while Karen slept smug in her bed, Jacob made his move. He slipped into her yard, bypassing her flimsy locks with the ease of a man trained to break into fortresses. He cut off her electricity from the main, leaving her house in darkness. Then he redirected her sprinklers to flood her perfectly manicured roses, drowning them in the very water she'd flaunted. By dawn, Karen woke to chaos. Her garden destroyed, her house powerless, her alarm clock dead. She stormed outside, screaming at the top of her lungs, blaming everyone and no one. The neighbors, for the first time, opened their blinds and watched, murmuring. The Queen of Willow Creek Lane had been struck, and not even she knew how. But Karen wasn't finished. Her pride wouldn't let her back down. Later that day, a city inspector showed up at the Martinez home with papers in hand. We've had complaints about your property, he said awkwardly. Noise, violations, unsafe conditions. Karen stood across the street with her arms folded, smiling like she had won. Alina broke down in tears. Daniel begged the inspector for time, swearing the complaints weren't true. And through it all, Jacob stood at the edge of his yard, his hands behind his back, staring at Karen like a hawk. That night Jacob paid her one final visit, not loud, not destructive, silent. He slipped into her backyard, leaving no trace but a single object on her porch, his old army dog tag scratched and worn. No note, no threat, just proof that he had been there, inches from her, while she slept unaware. When Karen found it in the morning, her face drained of color. She turned it over in her trembling hands, reading the faded name. For the first time, fear rippled through her. She realized this wasn't just some nosy old neighbor. This was someone who had lived in shadows, someone who had brought down men and women far more dangerous than her. That fear grew heavier when she looked across the street and saw Jacob, standing silently with his coffee, staring back at her. Not blinking, not smiling, just watching. Karen had declared war, but Jacob had shown her what a real soldier looked like, and she wasn't ready for the final blow. Karen tried to shake the unease off, but it clung to her like a shadow. Every time she stepped outside, she felt Jacob's eyes on her, not threatening, just watching. That silence gnawed at her more than shouting ever could. Her garden, once her pride, lay ruined, brown stalks drooping in the sun. Her power in the neighborhood was slipping. People she once intimidated now whispered behind her back. She felt cornered, but instead of admitting defeat, she lashed out harder. That evening, she marched to the Martinez house, pounding on their door until Alina opened, clutching her youngest child. You think you've won? Karen hissed, her voice shaking. This is MY Street. I'll make sure you're thrown out like trash. Before Alina could respond, Jacob appeared at the edge of the yard. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. He simply stepped between Karen and the Martinez family, his presence filling the air like a storm. Enough, he said. Karen sneered, but her voice wavered. You think you scare me. Jacob leaned closer, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. You don't fear me. You fear the truth, that without your cruelty, you are nothing. Power isn't making others suffer, Karen. Power is protecting those who can't fight for themselves. For a moment, the street was utterly still. The neighbors, drawn out by the noise, stood silently watching. Karen's face flushed, but her hands trembled. The cracks in her mask were finally showing. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She turned, storming back across the street, but she didn't look like a queen anymore. She looked small, beaten. The Martinez children ran to Jacob, hugging him tightly. Alina's eyes shimmered with tears. Daniel clasped Jacob's shoulder, whispering, "We'll never forget this." Over the following weeks, Corinne changed, not out of kindness but out of fear. She stopped harassing neighbors. She kept to herself, blinds drawn, roses never replanted. Her reign of spite was broken. People began to talk to one another again, to laugh in their yards without worrying about her complaints. Willow Creek Lane slowly breathed again. One evening, Alina brought Jacob a home-cooked meal. "You saved us," she said softly. Jacob smiled faintly, looking down at the children playing in the yard. "No," he replied. "I just reminded her what she can't take away from you." Alina tilted her head. "And what's that?" "Your strength," Jacob said. "Your family. People like her think cruelty makes them strong, but in the end it makes them weak, because kindness is what endures." That night Jacob sat alone in his house, the dog tag he had left on Corinne's porch now back in his palm. He looked at it for a long time, then placed it back in the wooden box. His days of fighting wars were behind him, but when the war came to his street, he had shown what true strength meant. And for the first time in years, Jacob felt something he thought he'd lost: peace. Cruelty may give people the illusion of power, but it is fragile and hollow. True strength is not in dominating others, but in protecting and uplifting those who cannot fight for themselves. In the end, kindness outlasts fear.